This is a fictional story inspired by real life. Edmund Wycliffe, the Duke of Rothermere, had married a ghost, or so the drawing rooms of London whispered once word got out that he had left his frail, coughing bride at a crumbling country estate a mere 2 days after their wedding. He had given her a title, a leaking roof, and his complete absence, and he had expected nothing more than a black-edged letter of condolence within the year. He did not expect to return 3 years later to a house that smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, run by a woman who had flatly refused to die. The ink on the parish register in the small London chapel took an agonizingly long time to dry that gray autumn morning. Edmund stared down at the wet, dark script of his own name, and beside it, the trembling signature of his new wife, Charlotte Pemberton, or as of 3 minutes prior, Charlotte Wycliffe, Duchess of Rothermere. The chapel was nearly empty, holding only the vicar, Charlotte's heavily indebted father, and a cold draught that rattled the stained glass above them. There had been no flowers and no music, for this was a transaction, plain and unadorned, stripped of the sentimental trappings that usually disguised the brutal commerce of the aristocracy. Lord Pemberton required £40,000 to keep his remaining properties from falling into the hands of his creditors, and Edmund required a wife to satisfy a tedious clause, buried in his late father's will, before he could accept a diplomatic post abroad. When Edmund finally turned to look at his new bride, he saw a slight woman nearly swallowed by the heavy gray wool of her traveling gown, her skin possessing the pale, bruised translucence of old porcelain, as though summoned by his gaze. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and surrendered to a rattling, violent cough that shook her narrow shoulders while her father looked away, embarrassed, as though her illness were merely a social inconvenience. Edmund felt no active malice toward her. He simply did not have the emotional bandwidth left to spare for a dying stranger, not while the whole of Europe balanced on the edge of war and his mind was consumed with troop movements, supply lines, and the cold arithmetic of foreign politics. Marriage was merely another obligation to be discharged before the more urgent business of his life could resume. "The carriage is waiting," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to fill the entire echoing chapel. Charlotte lowered her handkerchief, and her pale hazel eyes, red-rimmed but startlingly lucid, met his without apology. "I am ready, Your Grace," she said simply, and offered no further explanation for the interruption. The journey north lasted the better part of a day, the two of them riding in near total silence inside the velvet-lined carriage. Edmund occupied himself with dispatches from the Foreign Office, while Charlotte sat opposite him, shivering beneath heavy lap robes despite the fire warmers tucked at her feet. Their destination was Ravensmoor Hall, the most remote of Edmund's properties, tucked deep into the damp, unforgiving hills near the fictional Yorkshire village of Thistlewick, a place that had not been properly inhabited in 2 generations and existed chiefly as a place where inconvenient things were sent to be forgotten. When the carriage finally lurched to a stop in the fading twilight, Charlotte peered out through the rain-streaked window at a manor that loomed against the darkening sky like a rotting tooth, ivy digging its roots deep into the crumbling stone facade. Half the windows sat dark, and the other half reflected only the meager light of a single lantern held by an elderly servant standing on the cracked front steps. Edmund stepped down first, the mud instantly swallowing the soles of his boots, and he did not offer his hand to help his bride down, his thoughts already calculating the distance back to London. "Mrs. Whitfield will show you to your quarters," Edmund said, barely glancing at the house behind him. "The estate produces a modest income, but my solicitor will forward an allowance for your necessities. I ride for the coast at dawn." Charlotte pulled her cloak tighter around her thin frame and asked, quietly, how long he would be away, and he answered only that he would be gone as long as the crown required. He looked down at her fragile form in the gloom and felt a fleeting, uncomfortable twinge in his chest, not quite pity, but a cold acknowledgement of the reality before him that her lungs were failing and the northern winters were always harsh. "The air here is said to be good for the constitution," he told her. "I trust you will find peace." It was a dismissal disguised as a courtesy, a polite way of instructing her to die quietly and cause no fuss, and she understood him perfectly. "I understand," she said, her voice flat and resigned, though her hands trembled at her sides. Edmund tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the stables, where a fresh horse was already being saddled for him. He did not look back, telling himself it was simply the pragmatic choice, that lingering would invite a messy emotional scene he had no patience to endure. He rode out through the rusted iron gates as the rain began to fall in earnest, leaving his sickly bride standing alone in the mud, staring up at a house that looked very much like a tomb. Inside, the chill of the manor was absolute. Mrs. Whitfield, a gaunt woman with weary eyes, led Charlotte through cavernous hallways draped in dust sheets, the air thick with the smell of mildew, cold ash, and slow decay. "His Grace did not inform us of your arrival until yesterday," the housekeeper murmured, leading the way by a single flickering candle. "We only had time to prepare the master suite in the east wing, I'm afraid, and the fireplaces there draw poorly." Charlotte followed in silence, her chest burning with every breath, the dampness of the ancient house seeming to seep directly into her bones. When she was finally left alone in the massive, drafty bedroom dominated by a heavily carved four-poster bed, she did not cry, for crying required air, and she had none to spare. She simply laid her head back against the musty pillows, pulled the thin blankets to her chin, and let the fever take her. The first 3 months at Ravensmoor Hall passed in a blur of delirium and quiet suffering. Winter arrived with a vengeance, burying the manor beneath thick, suffocating drifts of snow, the wind howling through loose window frames and carrying the biting cold straight into the heart of the house. Charlotte nearly died in the depths of January, when the fever spiked so high it turned her skin to fire and her mind to ash, leaving her suspended for weeks in a hallucinatory haze, coughing until she tasted copper and soaking through the rough linen sheets night after night. Mrs. Whitfield and the 2 remaining staff, a groundsman named Samuel and a young scullery maid named Alice, tended to her with the grim, practiced detachment of people who had watched others succumb to the wasting sickness before. They kept a weak fire burning through the worst of the storms and forced thin broth down her throat, quietly waiting for the morning when they would find her cold and still. But that inevitable morning never arrived. Sometime in late February, the fever finally broke, and Charlotte woke devastatingly weak, her collarbones sharp enough to cut glass, yet her mind was entirely clear for the first time in weeks, a profound and startling clarity settling over her as she stared up at the water-stained canopy above the bed. She was not going to die, not in this miserable freezing room, waiting for a husband who had already written her off as a casualty of his own convenience. "Mrs. Whitfield," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping over stone, startling the housekeeper awake from her chair beside the dying fire. "Get me out of this bed and get me out of this room." It took nearly 2 full days to orchestrate the move. Leaning heavily on Alice's shoulder, Charlotte forced herself through the cold corridors of the house, ignoring the searing burn in her lungs, until she found a smaller room on the ground floor facing south, one with a modest hearth, heavy oak paneling that trapped the heat, and a window that caught the pale winter sun. "This one," she declared, breathless but resolute, leaning against the doorframe for support. Mrs. Whitfield protested that it was merely a housekeeper's parlor, unfit for a duchess, but Charlotte was unmoved. "I don't need a duchess's room," she replied, gripping the wood to steady herself. "I need a room that doesn't actively try to murder me, move my things." That was the turning point. Charlotte stopped behaving like a dying woman and started behaving like a living one who happened, for the moment, to be unwell. She reviewed the household ledgers and found the small but consistent allowance from Edmund's solicitor had been squandered under the previous absent management on polished silver, no one used, and expensive candles for rooms. No one ever entered. She ordered the waste stopped at once. "We board up the east and west wings," she instructed Samuel from her chair by the newly roaring fire in her small parlor. "Drain the pipes there so they don't burst come the freeze. Consolidate the living quarters to the central block, for we are heating far too much empty space, and use the money we save to buy properly seasoned firewood. I want fires burning in the inhabited rooms day and night." The servants were startled by her firmness, but they obeyed, and for the first time in decades, Ravensmoor Hall had a master who actually cared whether the draft crept in beneath the door. When spring finally clawed its way through the frozen earth, Charlotte ventured outside for the first time in months, and the crisp air lacked the stagnant, moldy quality of the Manor's dead wings. She found the old kitchen garden buried beneath briars and weeds, and rather than hiring a landscape architect or ordering ornamental roses, she simply told Samuel to clear the ground and sent to the village for practical seeds: thyme, rosemary, mint, and lungwort. Plants with purpose rather than mere decoration. At first, she could only manage 10 minutes on a wooden bench watching him work, but as the weeks passed, she began to kneel in the dirt herself, her expensive woolen skirts stained with mud, the labor so exhausting that pulling a single stubborn root could trigger a coughing fit that left her gasping on the grass for half an hour. Still, she refused to stop, for the smell of the turning earth felt like an antidote to the stifling dust of her old life. "You'll catch your death out here, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield would fret, bringing out a shawl against the chill. "I am catching my life, Mrs. Whitfield," Charlotte would reply, wiping a streak of dirt from her forehead, and she meant it entirely. She knew she was not cured, that the rattling in her chest remained a constant and unwelcome companion, and that some days the weather turned against her so badly she could not leave her bed at all. But she was no longer fading, only adapting, and Ravensmoor Hall adapted alongside her. The house, stripped of its pretentious and decaying grandeur, slowly became functional, even comfortable. Charlotte purchased heavy woolen rugs to cover the cold flagstones, and had the local blacksmith repair the kitchen ranges, so the manor always smelled of baking bread and roasting root vegetables rather than mildew. She spent her evenings in the small library wrapped in a blanket, reading agricultural texts and estate management guides by candlelight, and she stopped waiting for letters from Edmund almost entirely. For the first year, his solicitor sent a quarterly note confirming that funds had been deposited, but by the second year, even those brief notes stopped, though the money continued to arrive punctually at the local bank. She heard rumors from the village that the Duke of Rothermere was in Vienna, then in the German states, then in Spain, negotiating treaties and surviving political intrigue, but to Charlotte, he had become little more than a character in a novel she had no interest in finishing. Her reality was the ripeness of the tomatoes in August, the stockpile of firewood set aside for November, and the quiet camaraderie she shared with the servants who had, in every way that mattered, become her family. She had taken an empty, rotting shell of a house and filled it with warmth. She had forged a life out of nothing but scraps, and she no longer believed she needed a husband, for she already had a home. 3 years had passed in a blur of relentless, exhausting noise for Edmund Wycliffe, who rode through the northern countryside with a stiff posture and eyes ringed by the deep purple exhaustion of a man who had seen far too much. The continent had drained him entirely. 36 months spent wading through the muck of European politics, negotiating borders across tables stained with spilled wine, sleeping in military tents, and stepping over the bodies of men he himself had ordered into battle. London had celebrated him as a hero and showered him with honors, but he had stayed in the city only long enough to satisfy his king before fleeing, unable to bear the suffocating grandeur of the ballrooms or the sycophantic whispers of the nobility that grated against his frayed nerves. He needed silence, and above all he needed the absolute, dead quiet of Ravensmoor Hall. He had not thought of his wife in months, for communication had broken down entirely during the chaos of the later campaigns, and the last report from his solicitor, received well over a year earlier, had said only that funds were still being drawn from the estate account. He had privately assumed she was either clinging to a miserable thread of life or had already died and been laid in the family plot, with the solicitor simply too preoccupied to inform him. In truth, Edmund had quietly prepared himself for the sight of a grave, a neat and uncomplicated end to a transaction he barely remembered making 4 years earlier. He arrived at the boundary of the estate in the late afternoon beneath a sky the color of bruised iron, bracing himself for the overgrown gates and crumbling drive he remembered. Instead, his horse stepped onto a meticulously graded gravel path, and Edmund pulled back on the reins, his brow furrowing in confusion. The massive iron gates, rusting off their hinges 3 years earlier, now stood upright, scraped clean and painted a stark, protective black, while the oak trees lining the drive had been pruned to let afternoon light filter down onto the path below. A strange disorientation gripped him as he spurred his horse forward, for this was not the abandoned ruin he had left behind. As the manor came fully into view, that disorientation deepened into genuine shock. The east and west wings remained clearly shuttered, but the central block of the house was unmistakably alive, its windows clean and catching the afternoon light, the choking ivy hacked away from the stonework, and thick white plumes of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys, carrying with them the savory scent of roasting meat. Edmund dismounted by the front steps, noting there was no mud underfoot, the flagstones having been scrubbed and leveled with obvious care, and he pushed open the heavy front door without knocking, for it was, after all, still his house. The damp, sullen chill, he remembered, was entirely gone, replaced by genuinely warm air, a thick woven runner covering the once cracked floorboards, and a vase of dried lavender resting on a polished entryway table. The silence he had craved was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by the low hum of voices from the kitchens and the rhythmic thump of a chopping knife against a wooden block. Edmund unbuttoned his heavy riding coat, feeling entirely like an intruder in his own home, as he walked down the corridor, passing the grand drawing room with its doors firmly locked, and gravitating instead toward the warmth radiating from the back of the house. He found her in an estate office he had not known existed, the door standing slightly ajar. Charlotte stood at a heavy oak desk, leaning over a spread of architectural plans and household ledgers, and she was not the ghost he had left standing in the mud 4 years earlier. She remained slender, perhaps even painfully so, her skin retaining its striking paleness, but she was no longer fragile in the way he remembered. She wore a practical dark green day dress with the sleeves pushed to her elbows, her hair pinned into a ruthlessly efficient knot, several loose strands framing a face intent on the ledger before her. "The drainage in the lower paddock won't hold if we get another heavy freeze," she was saying to Samuel, her voice clear and entirely without the wet rattle that had once interrupted nearly every sentence. "We need the trenches dug deeper before November, and we'll use the funds saved from the barley crop to do it." Edmund cleared his throat, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Samuel spun around, eyes widening, snatching his cap from his head and bowing stiffly, stammering that they had not known his grace was expected. Charlotte froze, then slowly lifted her head from the desk to look at him directly. She did not gasp, and she did not swoon, but studied him instead with the precise, measuring gaze of someone evaluating a sudden and unexpected complication. Edmund took in the dirt beneath her fingernails, the faint ink smudge along her jaw, the absolute quiet authority with which she occupied the room, and thought, with a jolt he did not expect, that she looked magnificent, entirely and undeniably real. "You're alive," he said, the words slipping out blunt and almost stupid, less a greeting than an accusation leveled against his own mistaken expectations. Charlotte stood up straight and reached for a linen handkerchief resting on the desk, a reflex Edmund noticed at once, though she did not cough. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said, her voice smooth, polite, and cold as the northern winter outside. "I realize a widow's weeds would have caused you considerably less trouble." Edmund flinched internally at the direct hit, knowing it was entirely earned. "I did not mean," he began, then stopped. A man who had once talked down hostile generals now scrambling for words in his own hallway. "The house," he managed, finally, "it is different. The house is functional," Charlotte corrected, turning to dismiss Samuel for the day. When they were alone, Edmund looked once more at the neat ledgers and receipts arrayed across the desk, then back at his wife, unyielding as a ruler defending her borders from a foreign invader. "I expected ruins," he admitted quietly. too weary for further pretense. "You left ruins," Charlotte answered, chin lifting a fraction. "I simply refuse to be buried beneath them." Dinner that evening was a quiet, utilitarian affair, served not in the cavernous formal dining room, but in a small paneled breakfast parlor near the kitchens. Edmund sat at the head of the modest table, the only concession the house made to his rank, while everything else clearly belonged to Charlotte. The fine porcelain of his ancestors had been replaced with sturdy, unchipped stoneware, and the ornate silver cutlery was gone in favor of simple ironware that required no hours of laborious polishing. "The east wing will remain closed," Charlotte stated, not looking up from her plate. "We haven't the coal to heat it, nor the staff to clean it. Mrs. Whitfield has prepared the blue guest chamber for you on the ground floor, as it shares a chimney with my own parlor, so the fire will draw well." Edmund paused, his knife resting against the stoneware. 3 years earlier, she would never have addressed him with such plain authority, would have barely spoken at all, suffocating beneath the weight of her failing lungs and his terrifying indifference. Now he studied the faint, rapid pulse beating beneath the pale skin of her throat, knowing she was still unwell, that he could hear the careful, shallow way she drew each breath to avoid triggering a coughing fit. Yet she was no longer anyone's victim. "The blue chamber will be fine," he said simply, and a flicker of surprise crossed her eyes before she nodded once and returned to her meal. The following morning, Edmund woke to the sound of purposeful activity already humming through the house. He dressed and stepped out, intending to have Samuel saddle his horse so he could inspect the estate's boundaries, but found the groundsman in the courtyard repairing a broken wagon wheel instead. "Samuel, saddle my bay. I ride out within the hour," Edmund commanded, and the older man paused, the heavy mallet resting against his knee, glancing nervously toward the estate office window. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I must ask her Grace first. She's instructed me to finish this axle before noon, so we can transport the winter squash to the village market." A sharp reprimand rose in Edmund's throat, the instinct of a military commander whose orders had just been questioned, but it died there unspoken. He looked toward the office window, saw the flicker of a lantern within, and understood in that instant that he had abandoned this estate while Charlotte had saved it, and loyalty, he knew better than most men alive, was never a legal right, only something earned through years of quiet, unglamorous labor. "Finish the wheel, Samuel," he said quietly. "I'll saddle the horse myself." Over the following days, he came to realize precisely how superfluous he had become, an apex predator wandering through a highly efficient, closed ecosystem that no longer required his intervention. He tried once to review the household accounts while Charlotte was out in the garden, expecting to find the chaotic arithmetic of a woman untrained in estate management. Instead, he found a masterpiece of pragmatic survival. She had leased the neglected lower pastures to a neighboring sheep farmer in exchange for a share of wool and meat, eliminating the need for shepherds they could not afford, and had sold the ornamental lead from a ruined fountain to fund the slate needed to patch the roof. "If you're looking for missing funds, you won't find any," Charlotte said from the doorway, a basket of freshly cut thyme on her arm, her boots caked with mud, and her expression entirely unapologetic. "I am not auditing you, Charlotte," Edmund replied, closing the ledger. "I am simply trying to understand how my own estate functions. It functions because we waste neither time nor heat," she said, stepping further into the small office, "and because we do not spend money on appearances. If you intend to stay, Your Grace, you must understand that Ravensmoor cannot support the lifestyle of a duke. There are no valets and no footmen. If you drop a coat on the floor, it will remain there until you pick it up yourself. I have spent the last 2 years sleeping in canvas tents and eating salted pork that tasted of gunpowder," Edmund said, his voice dropping low. "I do not require a valet." He rose, towering over her despite her fierce posture, close enough to see the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her eyes that no amount of composure could fully hide. "I am not here to undo your work, Charlotte," he said carefully. "I am simply here." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie and finding none, her jaw tightening before she finally said, "Then stay out of my way," and turned back to her time. By the 3rd week, The sharp hostility between them had softened into a cautious, watchful neutrality. Edmund kept his word and stayed largely out of her path. Chopping firewood, repairing hinges Samuel lacked the strength to lift, and riding the perimeter of the estate to note the structural repairs Charlotte had prioritized and those she had been forced to abandon for lack of funds. Slowly, without quite meaning to, he learned the rhythm of her illness. That damp mornings were always the worst, that she drank copious amounts of a bitter mullein tea before the dew burned off the grass, and that when she pushed herself too hard, a dangerous flush would rise in her cheeks, followed by a hacking cough that sounded like tearing silk. He wanted, more than once, to order her to rest, but he knew she would only look at him with flat, cold eyes and remind him he had forfeited any right to command her health 4 years earlier. His opportunity to be useful finally arrived in the form of a letter from a neighboring landowner named Lord Carow. Edmund was cataloging water-damaged books in the small library when he heard Charlotte's voice ring out sharply from the office, and he found her standing over her desk, hands trembling with fury over a piece of parchment. "He cannot do this," she said, her voice catching on a rough cough she forced down with visible effort. "He is choking off the lower stream, and the mill will run dry by August." Lord Carow had responded to her 2 previous letters, with a condescending note praising her valiant attempts at husbandry, while insisting a woman could hardly be expected to understand centuries-old property boundaries. Edmund read the letter twice, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face, the very smile that had once made a foreign ambassador physically recoil at a peace summit. "You are dealing with this the wrong way," he said, pulling a fresh sheet of vellum from her drawer and dipping her quill into the inkwell. Men like Carow do not respond to logic. They respond to leverage. He did not threaten a lawsuit or mention the stream at all, but wrote instead a brief, exquisitely polite note informing Lord Carow that the Duke of Rothmere had returned to residence and looked forward to discussing his neighbor's recent, highly irregular tax assessments before the House of Lords, adding a postscript inquiring after a nephew whose gambling debts in London Edmund had quietly purchased before departing for the continent. 2 hours after Samuel delivered the sealed letter, he returned with a stammering, frantic apology from Lord Carow, promising the offending dam would be dismantled before nightfall. "That was blackmail," Charlotte said, reading the response. "That was diplomacy," Edmund corrected, not looking up from the boot he was calmly polishing, and for the first time since his return, the air between them no longer felt weaponized. The fragile truce shattered 3 days later when a brutal, unseasonal storm swept down from the northern hills, bringing torrential, freezing rain. Edmund was in the stables when the downpour began, and he ran back toward the manor expecting to find Charlotte safely settled by the hearth, but instead found the front door standing wide open and Alice frantically gathering soaked rugs from the foyer floor. "Where is she?" he demanded, dread pooling cold in his stomach. "The herb garden, Your Grace." The drainage ditch overflowed, and she went out to dig it clear herself. Edmund did not wait, sprinting out into the blinding rain until he found her kneeling in the freezing mud, wielding a heavy iron spade, soaked through and hacking desperately at the earth to divert water from seedlings she had spent months cultivating. She was no longer coughing. She was suffocating, her hands flying to her chest as her body convulsed, fighting to draw air through lungs filling with fluid and cold. Edmund reached her in 3 strides, scooping her up without asking permission, and she weighed almost nothing in his arms, fighting him blindly for a moment like a panicked, drowning creature before her head fell back against his shoulder, her lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. He carried her straight to her parlor, roaring for Mrs. Whitfield to bring hot bricks and towels, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man commanding a battlefield. He stripped away her soaked outer garments and wrapped her in heavy dry blankets from her own armchair, packing warmed stones around her shivering body and pulling her upright against his chest, supporting her weight until she finally dragged a ragged, agonizing breath into her lungs. "Breathe," he whispered into her damp hair. "Just breathe. I have you. You're all right." As the heat from the fire and his own body slowly seeped into her, The blue tint faded from her lips, and she closed her eyes, exhausted and, for once, entirely reliant on the man she had long sworn she did not need. Charlotte survived the chill, though it grounded her for a full week afterward, and the frightening relapse forced a brutal reality back into the forefront of both their minds, that she remained a woman constantly outrunning a shadow, and the storm had allowed that shadow to catch her heel. During that week, Edmund became, quietly and without announcement, her constant shadow in return, moving his ledgers into her parlor, handling estate correspondence, and sitting by the hearth through the nights her coughing woke her, sliding a cup of warm, bitter tea onto the table beside her bed. He never hovered, and he never offered pity, only maintained the walls of the fortress while she slowly rebuilt her strength within them. It unsettled Charlotte deeply, this quiet reliance, for she had built her entire survival on the certainty of her isolation, and leaning on Edmund now felt like leaning against a door that might suddenly swing open beneath her weight. Yet she found herself listening for the steady sound of his boots in the corridor, and she began to suspect she was not the only one carrying hidden wounds. That suspicion was confirmed one violent evening in late spring, when thunder cracked overhead with a deafening percussive blast that shook the very foundations of the old stone house. Charlotte, reading by her own fire, waited for Edmund to emerge from the blue chamber to check the windows as he usually did, but instead heard a low, guttural gasp followed by the heavy thud of furniture crashing to the floor. She found him backed into the farthest corner of the room, dressed only in shirt and trousers, his eyes wide, unblinking, and entirely lost in some other place and time, his hands raised before him with fingers curled like claws. "Hold the line," he whispered, his usually resonant voice cracked and broken. "Hold the line, damn you, they're coming through the smoke." Charlotte understood, in that instant, that she had spent 3 years imagining him at grand balls with foreign dignitaries, never once considering the actual toll of the diplomacy he had been sent to execute, that he had not merely signed treaties but had stood, again and again, in the slaughter itself. She did not call for the servants, knowing instinctively Edmund would never forgive being seen this way by anyone else, and instead moved slowly, deliberately, making her footsteps audible against the floorboards. "Edmund," she said softly, the same calm, low tone she might use to settle a spooked horse. He turned toward her with a flash of violence in his eyes, not recognizing her for a terrible moment, and she lowered herself carefully to sit on the cold floor before him, putting herself below his line of sight to remove any sense of threat. "The artillery is gone," she told him gently. "It's only rain against the glass. You are in Yorkshire. You are at Ravensmoor. Look at me. I am Charlotte. Look at the stones. Look at the hearth. You are home." A ragged breath finally tore through his throat, the wildness in his eyes fracturing into a devastating, crushing clarity as he looked down at his own trembling hands, then at his wife seated calmly before him. He covered his face, a raw, broken sound escaping him, muffled behind his palms, the sheer exhaustion of holding his own mind together for years finally giving way in a deep, structural collapse. Charlotte moved closer, kneeling beside him, and placed one hand flat between his shoulder blades, a simple physical tether, a quiet reassurance that he was not falling into the dark alone. They remained there a long while as the storm raged outside, until at last, when the thunder rolled away, he told her quietly of a cavalry charge he had once ordered outside a foreign town, of fog too thick to read the enemy's true position, of 400 men lost to a marsh he had not seen coming. "The mud looked like blood," he said. "I dream about the mud." Charlotte offered him no empty comfort, only rose, righted the overturned chair, and coaxed the dying fire back to life. "The mud here is just mud," she said. "It grows rosemary, and it grows thyme, and it ruins my skirts terribly, but it does not bleed. Now get up off the floor, for I have a mill to repair and no patience to nurse you through a chill as well." Summer baked the dampness out of Ravensmoor Hall, and though the heat was a harsh master, it proved kinder to Charlotte's lungs than the biting northern cold ever had. For the first time in years, she went an entire month without tasting copper in the back of her throat, and the estate transformed from a quiet refuge into a theater of grueling, satisfying labor. Edmund did not supervise the harvest from beneath a shaded canopy, but stripped off his fine coats, rolled up his sleeves, and worked the fields alongside the hired hands, hauling heavy sacks of grain, blistering his palms with a scythe, until the local villagers, who had once regarded the returning duke with terrified deference, began instead to watch him with a stunned, quiet respect. Men who bled and sweated in the dirt, they discovered, did not require titles to prove their worth. Charlotte managed the logistics from a wooden table set beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat, tallying yields and paying seasonal workers from a heavy iron lockbox, watching from a distance as Edmund handled a team of draft horses with an easy, powerful grace, a man built for war who had finally found somewhere safe to channel his suppressed energy. Late one August evening, with the courtyard finally silent and the last wagon secured, she remained at her table long after the workers had gone home, her chest tight with pure muscular exhaustion rather than illness. A shadow fell across her ledger as Edmund set a tin cup of cold well water down over the numbers she was struggling to read. "The math will still be there tomorrow," he said, and she took the cup with both hands, grateful for its shocking coldness against her palms. "We outpaced last year's yield by nearly a third," she reported. "The sheep have paid for the extra labor, and the grain money will cover the slate for the west wing roof at last." "We don't need the west wing," Edmund said, pulling up a stool across from her. "The central block is secure. Save the coin for winter coal, and let the west wing rot in peace." Charlotte traced the rim of her cup, remarking that she had always assumed a duke required at least one grand hall to entertain his peers. Edmund let out a low, humorless laugh, turning his palms upward to show them calloused, scraped raw, and permanently stained with soil. "My peers would take one look at these hands and assume I had gone entirely mad," he said. "Let them stay in London. I have no further interest in entertaining ghosts." He looked at her across the table in the fading twilight, which softened the sharp angles of her tired but undeniably vital face. "You look well, Charlotte," he said, and it was not a compliment born of polite society, but a plain, deeply relieved observation. "I am surviving," she replied. "You are leading," he corrected gently, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his own, trapping the tin cup between their palms, his skin warm against hers. "And I am following," she said, and did not pull away, instead turning her hand to lace her thin fingers through his two battered people holding fast to each other in the quiet ruins of the lives they had both once abandoned. The outside world finally breached the walls of Ravensmoor Hall that November, exactly 4 years to the day after their wedding. The frost thick, and the estate turned stark white and brittle brown. Charlotte was in the kitchen instructing Alice on curing the winter hams when she heard the sharp, frantic clatter of a galloping horse on the frozen drive, entirely unlike the slow, heavy tread of a working animal. She walked to the foyer just as Edmund pulled the front door open to reveal a royal courier, exhausted and mud-splattered, who bowed sharply and produced a heavy, sealed envelope bearing the sovereign's crest, insisting the Prime Minister required an immediate reply. Edmund took the letter but did not break the seal, staring at the wax with his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped visibly in his cheek, the sight alone seeming to drain the color from his face and drag him back into the cold, calculating world he had spent 6 months trying to sweat out of his bones. He sent the courier off to warm himself in the kitchens, then stood in the foyer with the envelope hanging from his hand like a dead weight. Charlotte felt a cold, jagged stone drop into her stomach, for she had always known, on some quiet level, that a man like the Duke of Rothmere could not simply disappear into the Yorkshire hills forever. "I will have Mrs. Whitfield prepare your trunks," she said, her voice gone perfectly flat, the voice of a housekeeper rather than a wife. "The roads will be treacherous within the week. You should leave by dawn." Edmund's head snapped toward her, his eyes suddenly sharp with anger. "You don't even know what the letter says. It says they need you," she replied, refusing to meet his gaze, untying her apron with hands that were not quite steady. "It doesn't matter which border is in dispute this time. You are the Duke of Rothmere, and they have a war they need you to help settle. You have played the farmer for a season, Edmund. You have paid your penance. Your conscience is clear, and you are free to go." She turned to walk back toward the kitchens, needing distance from him, needing to calculate how the household budget would survive without his labor through the coming winter, but Edmund crossed the foyer in 3 strides and caught her arm, spinning her gently but firmly to face him. "Stop," he commanded. "Let go of me," Charlotte said, her hazel eyes blazing with sudden defensive fury. "You have a carriage to pack." Instead, Edmund walked to the drawing-room hearth and tossed the still-sealed envelope directly into the flames. Charlotte gasped, stepping forward in disbelief, but he only watched the thick parchment curl and blacken as the fire consumed the sovereign's wax. "I spent my entire adult life trading pieces of my soul to keep kings on their thrones," he said, his voice ringing through the quiet hall. "I ordered men to die for borders that changed again within the week. I gave the crown my youth, my peace of mind, and very nearly my sanity, and I am not going back. I do not care if the whole continent burns." He closed the distance between them, framing her startled face in his rough, calloused hands. "I left a dying girl in a tomb because I was a coward," he said quietly. "I came back looking for an empty grave to hide in, and instead I found a queen ruling over a fortress she built with her own 2 hands, out of nothing but dirt and sheer, stubborn defiance. You saved my estate, Charlotte, and then, somewhere along the way, you saved me as well." Charlotte's throat tightened, the old urge to cough rising with sudden, overwhelming emotion, and she swallowed it down along with the last of her guarded pride. "I am still sick, Edmund," she whispered. "The winters will always be hard, and I cannot promise you that I won't." She could not finish the sentence. "I don't want a promise of eternity," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. "I want today, and I want tomorrow, and I want to freeze in the mud beside you trying to save the barley. This is my home, Charlotte. You are my home, and I am never leaving you again." She closed her eyes and let the last of her cynical armor crack and fall away entirely, gripping the rough linen of his shirt and finally, after 4 long years of cold isolation, leaning her full weight against him. He held her tight, a permanent fixture against the coming winter, the house around them quiet and smelling of wood smoke and rosemary, fiercely alive and, at long last, entirely whole. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only arrives after years of watching how quietly people rebuild themselves when no one is applauding the effort, and it is the kind of wisdom that Charlotte and Edmund's story tends to leave behind for those who have lived long enough to recognize it. It is easy, when we are young, to imagine that love announces itself in grand gestures, in flowers and music and declarations made in candlelit ballrooms, and it takes a longer, harder road to understand that the truest devotion often looks like a woman kneeling in cold mud, refusing to let a house or a body fall apart simply because no one else believed it was worth saving. Charlotte was not rescued by her husband's return. She had already rescued herself. One boarded-up wing, one bitter cup of mullein tea, one stubborn root pulled from frozen ground at a time, and there is something quietly instructive in that for anyone who has ever been left to face a hard season alone, whether by illness, by circumstance, or simply by the slow drift of people who once promised to stay. The lesson is not that someone will always come back, for many do not, but that a life rebuilt out of necessity can become, in time, a life chosen freely, and that is no small thing. Edmund's own arc offers a different, equally patient truth, the understanding that a person can spend years mistaking duty for identity, running from silence because silence forces a reckoning with everything left undone or unspoken, until eventually the running itself becomes the wound. His breaking apart on that storm-lashed floor was not weakness but the beginning of honesty, the moment a proud man finally allowed someone else to witness the cost of everything he had carried alone, and it was Charlotte's steadiness, not pity, that helped him find his way back. For those further along in life, who have perhaps buried a spouse, weathered a long illness, or spent years caring for a home and a family with little recognition, this story is not really about dukes and grand estates at all. It is about the dignity of small, unglamorous labor, the tending of gardens and ledgers and fires that no one else sees, and the way such labor slowly becomes its own kind of strength. It is about learning that survival and thriving are not the same thing, and that the difference between them is often simply the decision, made quietly and repeated daily, to keep choosing life rather than merely enduring it. And perhaps most gently, it is a reminder that reconciliation, when it comes, rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow accumulation of small honesties, a shared cup of water in a summer courtyard, a hand offered without demand, a willingness to sit on a cold floor beside someone else's fear rather than retreating from it. Whatever season of life we find ourselves in, there is comfort in knowing that homes, like people, can be rebuilt from very little, and that it is never too late for two people, however far they have drifted, to find their way back to the same warm hearth.